introduce him today. Dr. Polzin is the Program Director of the Mobility Policy Research Team, where his research concentrates on travel behavior, public transportation, travel data analysis, and transportation decision-making. Dr. Polzin is on the editorial board for the Journal of Public Transportation and serves on several TRB and APTA committees. Steve also teaches graduate courses on transportation and land use and public transportation, and he's published numerous academic articles, contemporary pieces, editorials, and blog postings. He also co-authored Commuting in America 2013, which is the AASHTO definitive resource on commuting. Steve served on the board of directors of HART, the local transit authority, for 13 years, the board of directors for the Hillsborough County MPO for 7 years, and he's a civil engineer with a bachelor's from University of Wisconsin-Madison and master's and PhD degrees from Northwestern University. Dr. Polzin worked for transit agencies in Chicago, Cleveland, and Dallas before joining our team here at USF in 1988. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Steve, who's going to talk about Florida transit ridership declines.
Thanks, Jody, and thanks, folks, for taking the time. Good afternoon to those on the East Coast, and good morning or whatever to other folks. It's a real pleasure to talk about this. It's a fascinating topic to cover and to spend time on. And as I was preparing my comments, I realized I had way more than an hour's worth of material. So you're going to get a fire hose of material here. As Stephanie mentioned, the slides are available, and we will have report documents that are part of this research that will be available probably around the end of the calendar year time frame. This is supported by Florida DOT. A lot of the research I've done on this, and I really appreciate their support and resources and review activities to improve the product here. The observations, and particularly the interpretations and implications, are things that the project team has done. They don't represent DOT policy positions, and folks should understand that. This does build on prior deliverables. We've had a multiple series of tasks in this project, and this builds on that. And if you have been watching in the past, we did do a previous webinar that's a little bit of a background for today's talk that was in March, and a follow-up one in April that one of the research assistants did that covers this same general topic that can give you some additional background. And it's entirely possible we'll have subsequent work when the project is finalized to share as well. I'm going to cover three basic things here, some update on trends. This refreshes some of the data that you might have seen previously, but it brings it up to date. I'm going to give you some discussion of some of the details on Florida trends and issues specifically, and then share some thoughts on an industry response. I will caution that as I move through this, some of my observations and data are at the national level, some are at the state level. Florida is not mirroring what's going on nationally. Some of both the magnitude of the trends and the underlying causes are different. So keep your ears peeled and look carefully so you understand whether or not I'm referencing Florida data and information and observations versus some broader national trends. This is kind of a table that I keep just to watch what's going on in the totality of travel. You may have seen it if you watched a previous seminar. This is updated through the first 2/3 of this calendar year. The kind of underlying metrics on the top that typically govern travel demand in general, population, employment, GDP, gas price, etc. And you can see how those things are tracking year to date. The green shaded 4 lines at the bottom are trends in the basic modes, and VMTs, which has been growing substantially faster than population growth for the past several years, has slowed this year. And so there's some evidence of plateauing, and it looks like by the end of the year we'll end up at a VMT per capita number that's slightly down after 3 or 4 years of recovery in that area. The next line is the public transit line. Again, this is national data from 2 different sources, both APTA and NTD data. And you'll see there an accelerating downward trend. And those of us that watch this closely on a monthly basis are really looking to see if we bottomed out. And at least in terms of aggregate data for this calendar year, it's unlikely to be the case. However, there's at least a little bit of evidence that more recently that we're starting to see the bottom on some of the ridership declines. At least that's the hope. Interestingly, Amtrak has had a little bit of softness this year, and for those of you that pay attention to overall trends, you should have invested in airlines a few years ago. They continue to do blockbuster business, and the relevance of that is it says something about people's aspirations and preferences in travel. That has some relevance as we think about urban travel as well. This is the classic graphic of VMT trends updated year to date, and you can see that the VMT per capita has actually dipped down a tad, and the rate of VMT growth has slowed again after a robust recovery through the economic recovery. So we're at least seeing some evidence of a plateauing of the rate of growth there. This is data on transit specifically. Again, it's a graph I've used previously, but it is updated through the first half or more of this year, I believe through July. And you'll see 2 trends here. The blue line is the national trend. The red line is the Florida trend. Both are continuing down in an almost linear fashion. Florida is a steeper decline than the nation, and that's certainly one of the motivations for trying to understand and evaluate and be in a position to respond to these trends going forward. These are the same national trends on a different scale. It shows a little bit of the history, and again you can see the downward trends in transit for both total travel and trips per capita, the softening that's been occurring over time. This is a real recent piece of information. This is September data for MDTA in Florida, and I pulled this up specifically. Miami-Dade is about 40% of the transit ridership in Florida. Typically, it's our strongest, densest, most urban market, and yet it's continued to see real disconcerting ridership declines over time. There was a little bit of good news in terms of the statistics. The September numbers are positive relative to August and relative to the prior September. Florida will see a little bit of benefit in the third quarter here because last year we were impacted by Hurricane Irma. That was a significant decline in transit ridership for about a month for many of the metropolitan areas. And so our year-over-year numbers will be more positive for the September-October time period and probably the last quarter of this year, partly because of weather-related events that hit some major metropolitan areas. But hopefully we'll see some plateauing of those trends. If you look at different agencies across the state, a number of them are seeing at least some evidence that they've hit bottom. This is commuting data. Also, since the last time I did a webinar, the 2017 American Community Survey data is out. And there's some kind of significant information. Historically, aggregate trends move relatively slowly. Single occupant auto has maintained its share in the 76-ish percentile area for a long time. If you look at changes recently since 2013, carpool has continued to decline. Transit's shown a decline. Again, this is just commuting. Bike and walk have also declined, but work at home has grown quite dramatically. And so, again, a lot of the things that we aspire to as planners aren't playing out. The things that we've advocated, carpool, transit, walk, bike, etc., are all under pressure. The area where we've seen some positive trends are work at home, which obviously reduces travel demand and congestion, but certainly doesn't necessarily help transit. The other piece of this that's important, and I elaborated on in a subsequent slide, is zero vehicle households are the lowest they've been since the annual data has been kept. About 5% of U.S. households with workers have no cars. And as an interesting tidbit, as of August this year, less than 30% of new vehicles sold were autos, meaning they were SUVs, vans, pickups, etc. So not only are we traveling by car as much as we've always done, but we're traveling by other light vehicles that tend to be a little bit less energy and resource efficient. These are those trends graphically. One of them that's gotten some attention, this is at the national level. The work at home, commuting, usual mode share passed up transit this past year. 5.2% of people report as working at home, where transit dipped down slightly to 5% report commuting by transit at the national level. And so that's gotten a little bit of attention. This is Florida data for the same characteristics, and you'll see work at home in Florida exceeds the national numbers quite meaningfully, and transit lags the national numbers quite significantly at about 1.7%. And so it's, and that's not new news to us. We've always lagged national averages in transit utilization, but the downward trend is a little bit steeper in Florida than was the case at the national level. This again is historical data. I'm showing the specific values for 2017 on the table this time, and so those of you that track that, and that's important because of the importance of auto travel. This is a graph that I've included that talks about declining trip rates, and I'll touch on those a little bit more later. But one of the things that we've not really looked at historically as it relates to transit use is how much of declining transit use is a result of simply lower trip rates, and nationally trip rates have continued to decline. And this is just some kind of anecdotal information about some of the things that are going on. E-commerce is growing rather dramatically. Homeschooling has increased. And interesting things like church attendance is down and movie tickets are down and football and baseball attendance is down. Banks are closing branches, etc., at record numbers. And that is having an impact, and subsequently I'll go through a little scenario about how that might be contributing to softer transit ridership as well. This is the overall organizing framework that I use when I think about trying to understand transit ridership trends. The first group is the demographic, economic, and land use factors. The second category is transit service supply characteristics, the quality and quantity of service we're delivering. And the third one is travel and communication options, i.e. what is the competition doing that we're facing out there. And I don't have the time to comprehensively and systematically go through each of these with the same level of detail and all of the components in the discussion, but this is the basic framework, so you kind of understand how we're doing it. These next couple slides show how I disaggregate that and the specific considerations that are discussed. in the technical documents that we've produced, and we'll be wrapping up into a final document. The land use factors, and there's several of them here, the demographic characteristics and the economic conditions are things that we've all looked at, and in many cases there's data available to support establishing the relationships of these factors to transit ridership. On the supply side, we've looked at service accessibility and service features and characteristics. Many of these can be supported with empirical data as well. Others are more qualitative data, but these are amongst the things we look at. And finally, on the third side, we're looking at what's going on in terms of communication substitution, changes in auto availability and competitiveness, cost, etc. And finally, the influence that transportation network companies, Uber, Lyft, and availability of other mobility as a service type options are having on public transportation ridership. When I look at transit competitiveness, I think it's sometimes useful to look at this empirical characterization of the national average transit trip. This is based on National Household Travel Survey data that came out just last fall. And the normal transit trip is about 55 minutes. It's got a 9-minute access time and an 11-minute egress time, about almost a 9 to 10-minute wait time, and about a 26-minute in-vehicle time. And so it's important when we think about how we're going to, modify, change service, understand, talk about this, etc. This gives a little bit of perspective of the components of time that face people when they make travel decisions. For those of you that have been involved in modeling and the like, you recognize that the onerousness of time spent waiting, for example, might be twice as much as the onerousness of the time spent in vehicle, etc. So they're not all equal, but nonetheless, it gives you a sense of the importance of the various factors. And each one in the red text, you'll see some comments there where, for example, access time is impacted by the network coverage, the stop spacing, and the land use patterns. The wait time is significantly impacted by the service frequency. The travel time and vehicle time is influenced by the speed, and the speed can be influenced by stop spacing, network circuity and design, exclusivity treatment, which drives vehicle speed, and dwell time, which might encompass everything from, fare collection technologies, handicapped service treatment, etc. So when I think through some of these things, this is a framework that I use to talk about where to focus on. When about a year ago, when people first started, or 2 years ago, started paying attention to declining ridership, kind of the traditional lay response was, oh, that's because we've cut service so much, and that explains it. And the empirical data doesn't support that. It certainly doesn't support that in Florida. We've generally grown service. We've certainly not grown it robustly, but it's ticked up a little bit. It did have some softness after the recession, but has generally grown modestly since that point in time. So declining service availability generally isn't a factor nationally. There are some exceptions. There are communities where it has been an issue, but generally it's not as important an explanatory factor as individuals kind of presumed, particularly when remembering the financial pressures on transit during the recessionary period. When we think of what's going on specifically in Florida, we looked specifically at how much population is indicated as within service areas. And on the left here, you'll see a trend of that. The service area, meaning the coverage of systems in the population in geographies that have service, have continued to grow and kept track with overall population growth in Florida. And this is a result both of population growth in some of our urban areas and some expansion, physical expansion of service. A few different counties have started adding transit service, etc. So we have had some increases in coverage in terms of whole new geographies with fixed route service, as well as some growth in population in areas that currently have service. The graph on the right-hand side characterizes for Florida Transit properties the relationship between the service change and the ridership change. You'll notice the upper left-hand quadrant has no cells in it, no properties that fall into that category, meaning nobody has seen increased ridership and declining service supply. Not surprisingly, the majority of transit agencies have had declines in ridership indicated by being below the zero line on the ridership graph. There are some with positive changes. In our case in Florida, a number of those are new systems that just started, and hence their numbers tend to be positive in this short period time frame that we looked at here. They're not weighted by total ridership or anything like that. But this is a way to give you a sense of what's going on. The vast majority of the larger systems are clustered around the in the bottom right-hand quadrant there, with somewhat negative ridership trends and generally modest increases or changes in service supply. In looking at service quality, we also looked at other characteristics. On the left-hand side, it'll give you some idea of the frequency that I've used a measure that I call service intensiveness here. That's vehicle revenue miles divided by directional route miles. And you can see that those numbers have been relatively stable over time, improving a little bit, which is suggesting we've either expanded frequencies and or hours of operation such that the number of bus trips on any given route mile have increased slightly over that time period. The right-hand graph is the speed, operating speed data, also based on NTD data, and you can see that does tend to fluctuate a little bit between the years, so I think there are some data quality and preciseness issues, but we're seeing a general downward trend in speed, and that, of course, is consistent with empirical data on growing congestion, particularly in Florida with our rapid growth. Not inconsistent with what transit agencies are seeing in terms of the challenge of keeping on schedule and growing traffic congestion in some of the urban corridors. This table, and apologize for the size, but it's one I had some fun with. It takes the analysis work that's done by the Accessibility Laboratory in Minnesota, and it looks at the ratio of population served within 60 minutes by auto compared to the population accessible by 60 minutes, within 60 minutes by transit. And they do this for 49 different communities across the country. If you look at the right-hand side of the table, you'll see the 4 Florida communities that they pay attention to in their analysis. And if you move to the far right-hand column, that's the real storyteller there. That's the ratio of jobs that are accessible within 60 minutes by transit compared to jobs that are accessible within 60 minutes by auto. And you'll see they're all single-digit percentages. The Miami's in the best situation, about 6.5% as many jobs accessible via transit in 60 minutes as is the case for auto. And that drops to as low as 3.7% for Orlando, 4% for Tampa, So when you think of, economic opportunity and employability, and scratch your head and wonder why we've had such a decline in zero-car households and growth in auto availability, this picture says a lot. The accessibility to activities, particularly in Florida, but generally true across the country, is dramatically higher for automobile-based travel than it is for transit travel. If you look on the left-hand side of the tables, you'll see some of the stronger systems with much more mature transit systems, and a number of those get up into the double-digit percentages. New York, of course, the best, with about 25%, as many jobs accessible within an hour via transit as by auto. But a pretty important consideration that people just need to understand, that that's the empiric reality in terms of our service supply levels, our densities, our roadway accessibility, etc. This is some data on the temporal changes in Florida in specific, and I draw your attention to the red colored cells at the bottom of the table on the left, and this is the difference between 2013 and 2016. That's really the period that we've been focusing on, the post-2013 timeframe. That's where we've seen the most pronounced move to the negative in transit ridership in spite of a robust economy. And here you can see population was up 5%, employed persons up 9%, households expanded by 5%, and household vehicles available expanded over 8%. So again, a fairly powerful change. The table on the right shows the service and ridership changes year over year. For Florida properties, gives you a sense of what's been happening there. As I indicated in some prior webinar, to me, auto availability is the single largest factor that's influenced transit ridership decline. The table on the left gives you NHTS data for the past two NHTS data collection cycles, and you can see there the number of transit trips per year in zero vehicle households versus one vehicle households at the national level and at the Florida level for the two different reference years of NTHS data. Again, you'll see a couple things that are interesting here. You'll notice that Florida, for example, has less transit use in zero vehicle households for both time periods than does the nation, and that's simply a reflection of the fact that we've got less transit supply. Our transit service is less competitive as a result of our land use and activity distribution patterns and the systems being less mature than in other areas. So folks, even with zero vehicles, are forced to have other means of travel more often, and hence they're not generating the same number of transit trips. Plus, we probably have a little bit older profile of individuals in zero car households that have less total travel demand as well. The table on the right, I've circled a couple cells there. If you compare zero vehicle households 2013 with 2016, you'll notice there's been an absolute decline in the number of zero vehicle households in Florida, in spite of substantially rapid growth in population. We've got a meaningful decline in zero vehicle households in that time period. This shows some of the characteristics of changes in commuting over that time period, the 13 to 16 time period. And we looked specifically at this in the context of developing some guesstimates, as it were, of what impact telecommuting might be having on public transportation. And this is one of those situations where you don't have real hard data on what the alternative means of commuting was for telecommuters, so we can only speculate. but I used a slightly older number. If 2.15% would have been transit travelers previously, that's the number from, I believe, 2016, not 2017. And if a person would have commuted 220 days per year, and if they would have had transfers, about 30% of them, which would have meant, a higher count of foregone transit trips from a perspective of measuring ridership. That factor alone had that have been the case, would explain a meaningful share of the decline in transit ridership over that period. In thinking about that a little bit, it's quite probable that the propensity for people who normally would be public transit users for commuting to shift and be in a position to telecommute might be below the average. They tend to be service workers and other things where physical presence is probably a prerequisite. On the other hand, commuting by transit is probably more onerous than some other means of commuting for mid-skill level workers, and if they had an opportunity to telecommute, they might well do that in light of the time savings, etc. So it's purely speculative here, but this gives at least a sense of the magnitude of potential significance of growing telecommuting, and the fact that that can in fact be explaining some declines in transit ridership. Another scenario that we put together that plays against the same issue. The data on the left is from the National Household Travel Survey, and this is data on trips per person per day based on NHTS data, and it shows the step down in trip making over time. That's been relatively consistent since as far back as 1995, but continued, in fact, even accelerated between 2009 and 2017. And a lot of that is a decline in shopping and errands, a little bit in work, and a little bit in social recreation. And those declines are relatively consistent with some of the other observations. People are using social media instead of meeting face-to-face, etc. People are shopping online. So those declines are real. And if you do some scenarios with those, if you take that decline over a 3-year period, and you apply it to the 21.5 million Floridians that are over 5 years of age, and if you assume that even 2/3% of those foregone trips would have been transit trips previously, that can explain a 10 million annual trip reduction, which is a meaningful decline of transit use over that same time period. So as you can see, it starts to help understand some of the things that might be occurring. Obviously, a fair number of assumptions in that, but nonetheless points out what's going on. Another area where we spent some additional time and did some analysis dealt with the issue of TNCs and what's going on with TNCs and might they be impacting transit ridership. And this slide gives you some data. Most of this came from a report by Bruce Schaller that talked about the growth in TNCs relative to transit. There's a couple of things I'll draw your attention to here. 37% increase in 17 over 16. So we've got a mode that's still growing very, very rapidly. We'll probably see similar numbers here. You can see there the prediction is for 2018 TNC and taxi use combined to exceed 4.74 billion annual trips. And in that scenario, he was forecasting that TNC and taxi use would surpass ridership on local bus service in the United States, which again is fairly significant when you think of the implications of that. Now, that's not all transit service, that's just bus service. rail service is about a similar number. So it would basically be saying TNC and taxis are about half of total transit ridership nationally. TNC use is concentrated in large metro areas that where those services are both more economically viable and were deployed earlier, so they're more mature and readily available. 70% of the trips are counted in the 9 largest areas. For Floridians, that does include Miami as one of the top 9 markets in the country for TNC use. And in seeing that, I recognize those same list of cities as being the top or amongst the top transit use cities as well. Crunch the numbers, and those cities also constitute about 72% of U.S. transit ridership. So there's evidence here that TNC and transit are in fact both viable in the same kinds of markets or are most robust in the same kinds of markets in terms of demographic and geographic size and characteristics. And TNC users, at least initially, were early adapters tended to be younger and higher income. As that service becomes more mature, I suspect the demographic profile of the average user will start to shift. And part of that concentration of income and stuff is associated with the cities that they exist in, which tend to be higher income cities as well. There is, interestingly, census data that's based on administrative records from IRS receipts that tracks the number of people who are employed as livery operators and tracks their reported gross receipts that they submit as part of their tax filings each year. And these are the graphs of the trends in those statistics. Data through 2016 was released this July, and you can see the rapid upward slope in both of those trends, particularly the number of employees ramped up much faster than did the receipts, and that's simply because more of the TNC drivers are part-time and not full-time, so the average receipt per driver has dropped about in half because the old historical data was full-time independent cab operators, and now it's the remaining old-time independent cab operators mixed with a whole bunch of TNC operators, most of whom are part-timers. But so we do have a database that allows us to look at what's going on in TNC use and track those trends. This is TNC use for multiple years for various counties in Florida, as well as the state total. So if you look at the jumps up on the y-axis, you'll get the year-over-year changes in numbers, and you can see that for the various counties. Not surprisingly, TNC use is concentrated in our largest counties, but it's also concentrated in those counties where public transportation is most viable as well. Again, consistent with that observation and trend otherwise. There's been some work to understand what means of travel TNC users might have used previously, and this was some survey work that was reported in a TCRP project that was released earlier this year, and you can see a meaningful number of individuals when surveyed indicated that had they not used TNC in the past, they would have used public transit in lieu of that for their trip purpose. And some indicated that they have used TNCs to connect to transit as well, but a bigger number here in the line of a previous mode indicating that transit was a previous mode. There's a few other cities since that time. Boston, there's a data point for Boston now as well. It's actually, I believe, higher than these. I think that was 42% previous transit users, etc. So it gives us a little bit of flavor. I played with a scenario specifically looking at Miami. I looked at the change in transit ridership between 15 and 16. Then I looked at the change in TNC operator receipts for Dade County. I guestimated TNC trips based on rider receipts. And then I assumed that the occupancy of those TNC trips would have been 1.2 persons, and half of them would have required a transfer, meaning they would have counted as 2 transit trips. Crunch the numbers just to get a sense of scale of how many transit trips might have been foregone if we assumed, in this case, 20% would have been made on transit in the absence of TNC service. And that suggests that the diversion to TNC could explain almost 32% of the decline in ridership on transit in Miami. Again, these are scenarios that are created, but they're intended to give a sense and perspective of the magnitude. I think they're pretty reasonable. They're based on a fair familiarity with the data sets, etc. But we don't have hard data on, for example, would a TNC foregone trip, would it have involved the transit trip alternative? Would that have involved a transfer or not? That we don't know, for example. More than we can get into in detail here, but just to give you some feedback here. The impacts of TNCs and transit ridership may be different across time and geography. And I say that because some of the early work looking at TNCs initially expected it to be positive for transit. I think empirically that's not been borne out. Certainly there's some complementary roles for TNC, but there's also some competitive roles. Additionally, depending on what reference time period folks looked at, I think the impact of TNCs on transit was modest early on as TNCs were rolling out and being accepted and expanded in both geographic coverage and availability and response time, etc. But my feeling is that in the more recent past couple of years, that they're meaningful in terms of their competitive situation with public transportation. So like I said, some prior work suggested if you go back to 2010 to 2016, they said TNCs weren't significant factors. I would argue that if you went, say, from 2015, 16, 17, that they are significant factors and are impacting transit ridership in the more recent time frame. And I think, and certainly there's some risk that will continue to be the case. Although I will add that TNCs are not a stable mode, i.e. their prices have gone up quite dramatically and may continue to as they move toward publicly traded companies that need to make a profit. So their competitive situation is likely to change over time as well. In terms of some interpretive comments, and again, we just scratched the surface of some of the things that we've looked at in this overall set of work, but a couple of observations I think are important here. This is clearly a different time. The change in transit use, both in magnitude and pace, and pervasiveness is different than in previous history. It's not the normal cyclical fluctuations. There's some more profound things going on. The travel choice that travelers are seeing now are meaningfully different, and that's influencing their decisions, and a number of them are choosing to forego public transportation, obviously. And clearly, as people are seeing more options, and those more options might be, buying something online through Amazon or telecommuting or taking TNC, for example, they're looking at that choice set and they're choosing alternatives. They're finding those options superior, in spite of the fact that, particularly in Florida's case, I don't believe our transit has gotten worse. There's no compelling evidence that service quality has deteriorated dramatically, and hence, people left because it wasn't good. They left because the alternatives were better. So in terms of their personal utility, they've maximized that. Now, I'm not implying that transit's, as good as it could be or as good as we'd like it to be, et cetera, but I'm saying that it hasn't deteriorated. And I qualify that because there are places in the country where it has deteriorated. Safety, reliability, cleanliness, comfort, on-time performance, those conditions have declined meaningfully in select transit properties across the country. But that's not necessarily been the case in Florida. In Florida, people have chosen other things because they had those options. In many cases, that meant they could afford a car now because the economy's improved. And in other cases, it meant they've shifted to online, TNC, etc. This is a graph that I used previously, and I'm just want to paste it up here for reference again. Different segments of the market are impacted by different factors. Choice travelers and higher income individuals are more sensitive to certain things like TNC availability, speed, etc. Lower income shares of the market are significantly impacted by things like car affordability, gas prices, and access to service by virtue of household location, etc. And so I think it's important to understand some differences there. Moving to the response to ridership, I've categorized the responses I'm putting in the report into those 4 areas in the green box on the left-hand side of the slide here. What do we do to mitigate the decline? As the first bullet point. The second one is how do we mitigate or offset the impacts of declining ridership? And by that I mean, obviously in a perfect world we'd get those riders all back, but if we can't get them all back, is there some things we can do to offset the consequence, i.e. the decline in productivity and efficiency and environmental contributions, etc., that our systems are making, and can we in effect do other things to mitigate the consequence of fewer folks using public transportation, such that, for example, our environmental profile remains attractive and is not deteriorated because ridership's down 20%, so hence we're 20% less effective in influencing emissions and energy efficiency. The third one is one that we've talked about in other venues in terms of positioning public transit to really play a broad role in this mobility as a service world, become mobility providers in a broader sense, in a role there. And the fourth one is these kinds of activities, the changes that we're seeing suggest that we may need to more seriously reflect on how we do transportation planning, particularly long-range planning. How do we deal with uncertainty? What lessons have we learned in going through this, etc., as we move forward? So I'm going to touch a little bit on some of these things. I've got no means have time to cover all of them. One important point that I think needs to be made is in the box in the bottom right-hand side. The kind of the gut response is, folks, is okay, so what do we do about it? How do we get the riders back? And it's important for people to understand that we can't necessarily undo the factors that have caused this decline in ridership. And to be kind of brutally frank about that, it's, yeah, we can take their cars away, outlaw Uber, Lyft, and shut off the internet. We're not going to do those things. A lot of the things that have contributed to the competitive position of transit are fundamental technology enhancements. They're things that have tremendous positive benefits for society. Yes, we can think about pricing and regulating and equity and other issues associated with these phenomena that are occurring, but we're not going to undo those. So when we face the issue of restoring transit ridership, it's not, kind of backtracking. If the decline in demand would have been attributable to service cuts, then, the common typical response reaction. Oh, okay, well, we just restore that service and we'll get our riders back. But that's not the situation in this case. It's a little more nuanced than that. In this image, I characterize some tactics and strategies, specifically with respect to service design and positioning, that we can use. I do use the characterization of transit dependent and transit choice. I realize not everybody's enamored with that terminology. But I think, and I know it's a continuum, but I think it's important because the different markets do have different characteristics, and how we can appeal to them can vary across those markets, so we need to be sensitive to that. In terms of stabilizing the transit dependent market, obviously, classic improvements in transit service, hours, frequency, coverage, connectivity, speed, etc., can help. And by help, I mean, if transit service is better, somebody that's on the bubble and was thinking about, getting a car, etc., might forego that decision because they're very comfortable with the quality and availability of public transportation service, etc. So those basic improvements are still going to be valued, and they can soften the impact of the aspirations to move to vehicle ownership in situations where those exist. We can also do things, that basic service improvements that will induce more transit trips by dependent travelers. If pricing, service quality, availability, etc. are good, you're going to get some additional trips out of existing markets, simply based on the convenience and availability of service. The third one here is perhaps the most significant one, and this is one that's just starting to be looked at in more detail. But there's been concern that low-income, transit-dependent, and transit-intensive individuals have been priced out of geographies that have historically had good public transportation service because of housing affordability and regentrification, etc. And there's a meaningful number of people that have, in effect, moved to new areas that are less dense, more suburban, less transit available, and then they're in effect trapped into needing to secure household vehicles, etc., to have accessibility in those environments. There is work underway that's trying to quantify that. Obviously, that's a trend that doesn't occur instantaneously, and one that's been impacted by particularly the urban housing cost issues. And it does suggest that there may, in fact, be some markets that have changed over time, and that we need to look at our demographic characteristics, and particularly areas that are changing. Their profile is changing, and we may need to steer some service in different directions to appeal to those markets. The next set of columns is to appeal to the transit choice travelers. And there, oftentimes we're seeing some success in targeting service to areas where there's a transit competitive advantage. Airports, convention centers, major intermodal facilities, arenas, stadiums, etc. Places where there might be parking costs, you might want to not be driving because you're imbibing, congestion, etc. And we're seeing some success in folks targeting those market areas. Not only are they potential transit markets, but they can introduce a new set of travelers to the transit option, and help in the long term in terms of attracting ridership. Target premium services to long distance trips where transit can be time competitive. Choice travelers are looking for stuff that's competitive. They do have a choice. Transit's ability to be competitive tends to be for longer distance trips where the access and egress times can in effect be amortized over a longer distance line haul time. And this, of course, works where you have particularly where you have exclusive travelway or guideway, or at least a longer distance of relatively high-speed travel, to help amortize that access egress time that can deter transit use for short trips in particular. And finally, more communities are building and evolving to having more transit-intensive environments and areas where they've implemented TOD or they've matured and developed to the point where it becomes viable to for a household to operate with no or fewer vehicles. And to the extent that we can build and target those areas, we have some opportunities to grow service. I've used these graphs in the past, and let me talk a little bit about the one on the bottom right here. And as it relates to Florida in particular, we've got a lot of what you would characterize as relatively poor transit service in Florida, meaning long headways that aren't attractive to choice travelers. And we have this dilemma where if you've got a 60-minute headway and you quote double transit service and now it's 30 minutes, that's certainly better, but it's not better enough to attract a choice traveler. And so there needs to be a recognition of what quality of service is really going to be necessary to attract choice travelers. And then to provide that quality of service, are we going to be in a position where we would have sufficient demand to justify the investment? And that's the real box that a number of places are in Florida and trying to overcome that. I'm going to click through a couple changes here. I apologize, I'm running long. This is one that struck my attention here. Florida has the highest share of uninsured drivers of any state in the country, 26.7%. When you think about pricing, we're basically letting a lot of people drive at far less than the full cost of driving. It's unfair to folks that are insured, etc. And a meaningful number of these are probably uninsurable and would be using transit if we simply enforced driving insurance laws. Finally, and again, apologies for not having time to really get into this, but when we think about the future of transit, it's oftentimes useful to focus on the key goals: mobility, resource efficiency, and economic competitiveness. And then how do we deliver that? Oftentimes we get caught up in this discussion of, well, how can we return to the situation that existed 5 and 10 years ago? And the answer is we can't, but let's focus on how do we give our markets mobility, how do we provide resource efficient mobility, and how do we ensure economic competitiveness of our urban areas. And so we move away from some of the pure discussion of restoring transit and think in broader terms of mobility needs of the public. That's all we have time for today. I'm be glad to take any questions for those of you that have time to hang around when the reports are available. We'll make that known and may well do a follow-up final presentation on this at some future date to talk in more detail about tactical and strategic responses in terms of changes in planning, etc.
All right, Steve, thank you so much. Since we are out of time, what I'm going to do is there are several questions in the Q&A box. What I'll do is I'm going to download them. I'll send them to you. And then if you could just respond to them with a short written response, and then we can post them below the recording. And I just want to make sure that everybody who has the question would get their question answered. What I'll do is I will open up the poll question box that had the space for the name, email, and organization. So if you haven't provided that information below, please do take a moment to complete that poll question, and we'll get those questions answered. Again, I have opened up the evaluation. If you could take a few moments to complete that evaluation, as the feedback provided is very important to the webinar series. And we do have one more webcast left for the 2018 calendar. That will be in 4 weeks in December on MPO staffing and organizational structures, presented by one of our senior researchers here, Mr. Jeff Kramer. Again, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.